Depend the person.
So now to speak, not exactly something completely different, but connected. As Antonio will know, I'm late with my manuscript, so maybe I can start to tell you some of the things that we've been talking about in smaller groups and that I have been thinking about since a longish time, but probably if we need a starting date, we go back to December 6th, 1992, when a group of volunteers belonging to and organized by what is clearly the longest standing fascist paramilitary in the world, destroyed a 16th century mosque which was no longer in use. And this form of mobilization was the beginning of the Hindu right-wing movement in India. Now, for some peculiar reason before this, various forms of nationalism in what we now call the Global South and what was then known as the Third World were regarded as, on the whole, good things. The bad nationalisms were all the developed countries who had colonies, and the good nationalisms all came from people who had somehow been oppressed. And since this was also the beginning of a movement called post-colonialism, we then decided and found that there was a strong divergence of two directions of thinking. One which remained resolutely exceptionalist, and the other which actually started to try and conceptualize the connections of the world. Now, India has had from 1925 its own fascist movement. I'm not going to talk about it, but I would like to say that we now celebrate the 100th anniversary of a paramilitary movement that was set up in consultation with a number of Italians who were consulted in the period from 1922 to 1925 in the best way to set up a paramilitary movement. The problem of writing on fascism in India have been both conceptual and practical. Archives vanish or are made to vanish as you approach them. Great swathes of material mysteriously relocate themselves. Official websites are rewritten, and family members of historical actors are retrospectively hypersensitive to the demands of historical scholarship for transparency or requests for access to documents. And although many families in India have pictures of Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, or other fascist or Nazi luminaries in the physical, moral, or metaphysical equivalent of their attics, sometimes in the company of a prominent family member who had traveled to Europe in the interwar years and had managed to get himself into the same frame as a fascist leader, later generations are understandably reluctant to place these stories and their accompanying documentation in the public domain. An initial problem that we have always faced is the question of exceptionalism that we just referred to. Fascism as a European phenomenon, others as inadequate imitators who don't quite understand. But that, in a way, is only a starting point, because recently the journal Fascisms sent a call around for a discussion on decolonizing fascist studies. And my own response in a few pages was it cannot be done, because those who should be decolonized are in fact sometimes fascists too. So what do you do when the decolonizer is a fascist? Do you decolonize fascist studies, or do you bring colonialism into fascist studies? In 1933, Dr. Karl Haushofer, to whom is credited the early iteration of the Lebensraum theory, which, as you know, stated that the Germanic people had destiny on their side as they expanded their influence and population eastward, wrote his tribute to Adolf Hitler's ascent to power. His pamphlet talked about the rebirth and renewal of nations under fascism. And he did not hesitate, of course, to call Nazism fascism even at its moment of birth. He named Italy, Japan, and Germany as countries to have benefited from this process of rebirth under fascism, leaving no doubt as to his understanding that all three political systems could be subsumed under the concept fascism. He added that this rebirth through fascism was very shortly to be achieved by countries like India. Haushofer had already set up an Indian branch of his organization, the Deutsche Akademie. It counted among its members Ashok Bose, a nephew of the later well-known Indian collaborator with Nazism, Subhash Chandra Bose. He was a chemist. It also contained two veterans of the Bengali Swadeshi movement of 1905, which of course believed very strongly in the importance of the Japanese defeat of Russia in 1905, were referred to by one of them as the men of 1905. These two men were Taraknath Das and Binoy Kumar Sarkar. They had admired Japan's militarist prowess, and Japan's victory over Russia in the war of that year was a glorious moment in the awakening of the East. This romanticization, by the way, persists in the writing of many people, not least in the popular, I hesitate to say populist writing of people like Pankaj Mishra. Binoy Sarkar, of course, wrote his own tribute to the coming to power of Hitler in 1933. He described Hitler as Vivekananda multiplied by Bismarck. Now, Vivekananda is one of the early godmen that gave India to the world and becomes quite important in the intersections of German Indology and Indic thought, as it is now come to be called. And there's a whole genealogy of Indian and Eastern mysticism in early Nazi self-organization, particularly in Austria, where the Indian community flew the Nazi flag in the early 30s and therefore long before the Anschluss. The Indic roots of things like the Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's Society for the Borrowing of Indian Mysticism, among other things, could create a frisson of ressentiment-laden Indian intellectuals smarting from years of colonial denigration of a degenerate Indian culture and this appropriation of the Indic or of various things Aryan was something to be welcomed. Binoy Sarkar, too, had seen nothing new in the sources of the new Germanic awakening. Nietzsche, he wrote, had plagiarized most of what he knew from India. The ancient commentator who wrote the Arthashastra, possibly a 4th century before Christ, text about the arts of the material world, and of doubtful authorship, whose doubtful author was probably called Chanakya or Kautilya, and may or may not have been a minister in the court of Chandragupta Maurya, was the predecessor of European thinkers like Machiavelli. But Sarkar could see many parallels between an Indian national awakening and the self-strengthening movement of German Völkisch thinkers. For Sarkar, the German heroes of Indian nationalism were Fichte or Herder. I did already talk a little about what we might call the Italian connection. Of course, some of these connections were mediated through the university set up by the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal, called Vishwa Bharati, like the world in India is the imagery that you get from it. It's doubtful that he was completely in control of all the things that went on in his university, but he was certainly aware that certain shall we say, parochial trends, and a great deal of the connections with Italy came through his university. Now, there's a question of charisma involved here as well, and there was, at some point in the 20s, a controversy about Tagore's adulatory writing about the shape of the head of Benito Mussolini, which he greatly admired. Yeah. He, of course, said he was not a fascist, and he had advisors who had explained to him what it was that made fascism fascinating to some people, and he was very quick to make the distinction between an admiration of fascism and an admiration for the head of Mussolini, which raises interesting question about the nature of charisma, which we won't go into here. But rather than stay in the specifics here, I would like now to switch course a little and to talk about how we can try to theorize some of these questions. Because what we can get from event histories, individual trajectories, institutional histories, which are all closely entangled, and the question of whether we can find a specific, in this case, Indic dimension to these histories, might actually be the wrong question, given that fascisms shared much, even as they all claimed the uniqueness of their national genius. How mainstream were views of national belonging as related to race or authenticity, ethnicity, the nation as a body, the folk as the authentic people, the uses of eugenics, norms of physical fitness? How many of these ideas were part of a zeitgeist? Do we want to use a zeitgeist argument? To what extent was this zeitgeist based on longer histories that date back to the 19th century, of romantic and romanticizing engagements with the irrational or the magical, with the allegedly racial or pure, with Western appropriations of Eastern thought and the returning of Eastern thought to India via the West, as in the Theosophical Society, or in another variation, an organization less well known, the Arya Samaj, which was both religiously informed and made much of the connections between the Hindu religion and the Aryan race. Now, Arya is a very ambiguous word in Indian languages, meaning various things from pure and noble to a great deal of lesser things. But a number of the elements now associated with fascism in one way or the other, militarism, national discipline and mass mobilization, eugenics, Aryanism, the excitement of modernity, the pleasures of homosociality, have longer histories that cannot be subsumed merely within a history of fascism, but they are certainly a part of the history of fascism. It is also important not to draw a linear set of origins. A genealogical approach with branches of a family tree that died out would then need to be combined with for want of a better term, a teleology of fascism that is at least implied. So I'm suggesting that we are looking at something from both ends, from a development of a set of ideas, some of which die out, some of which take different forms. And if we try to generalize this and look in the 1920s, we might find that a great deal of the primeval swamp that we would call socialism is not yet differentiated into species that emerge onto the land and then start to develop as distinctively fascist or socialist. But right through this period, there are certain shared ideas which cross over easily. And this finally brings me to the title of the talk I have placed before you, which is a fascist repertoire and fascist rhetoric. And the reason I place it before you in this way is because I think this offers us a resolution of a kind to the question of whether something is or isn't fascism. Now, we know that as we have developed in the direction of understanding fascisms as a family of ideas, we are often faced with the definitional question, does it cross a line, does it not? And I think what's useful is to think of a repertoire of ideas which is not always mobilized all at once and in the same place. And this is probably something that is harder to understand if we are talking about a political context. It is impossible that in a context which is dominated by fascist ideas, that some, if not all, of other groups connected to this political domain would not be using similar sets of ideas. So the fascist rhetoric or the fascist repertoire may not at all times be used only and exclusively by fascists. Now this, of course, if you want to find a theoretical analogy for this, could take us back again to Quentin Skinner, which I don't think is in the spirit of what he said, but is certainly a corollary to what he said. You could argue that the idea that one must engage with given ideas before one can change them, there must be a docking point for an idea, is as true of the idea of a national socialism, which of course draws not a little from the idea of a socialism as it does from the idea of a national, to ideas of a resistance to certain kinds of discourses. I will give you a small note from the third eugenics conference, which I think was in 1932, in which there was a very strong split between the socialists and the non-socialists. The socialists believed that it was impossible to understand what was inherited and what was not, unless human beings had achieved equality. But nobody really disagreed that eugenics was a good thing. And every socialist said that imbeciles should be sterilized goes without saying. That's a quote. So if we are to start to talk about this in terms of the difficulties of classification, then I think what we need very strongly as a parallel concept and as a pre-concept, if you like, is the concept of the Völkisch. Because the idea of seeing the nation as an organic, internally disciplined body that must purge itself of its impurities and that must remember itself back into the past to achieve the future. It's a kind of amnesia model of ultranationalism. We were once great, we've forgotten. In order to remember it properly, we must also remove the bits that create this misrecognition, and therefore we must proceed forward as pure. This becomes an important part of the self-understanding. And there, we can actually start to see why some of this might even be traced back to parts of the writings of Giuseppe Mazzini. Because in a Mazzinian worldview, when everybody finds their natural nation, the world becomes harmonious. So there is no necessary conflict in that view, except that nations simply don't settle into their own natural territories, as we know. And that's where the difficulty begins. So let me kind of end by making a few questions of approach more clear. If we think of fascism as a family of ideas with common, though often disavowed roots, common intellectual underpinnings, styles and organizations of movements, sometimes even a strong overlap of personnel, and I could talk at length about this, but I won't. In fascism and pre- or proto-fascists, the latter terms being less useful if we think in terms of a continuum, shared worldviews and ideas in communication that took place across regional and national boundaries, somewhat awkwardly given that fascists claimed the unique genius of their particular nation. They shared much common ground in terms of romantic irrationalism, the concept of the intrinsic inequality of human beings of different types, or the transcendental nature of violence. So different elements of a fascist repertoire can be mobilized in different contexts for different purposes. This repertoire tends to include a claim to an organic and primordial nationalism, the idea that the nation is in blood and soil, and everybody who belongs has to share that, and a controlling statism that disciplines the members of the organic nation to act for, as, and in that organic nation. Then again, the nation must be purified and preserved by cleansing it of its impurities. You get the idea, these are reasonably common. As fascist movements develop across the world, lesser movements take the form of their more successful cousins. This I have called a voluntary Gleichschaltung, which I mean, of course, Gleichschaltung is the synchronization or forcible coordination of organizations and institutions in Germany to conform to Nazi ideology. And I use the word voluntary as a deliberate oxymoron. Each fascist movement, however, simultaneously maintains that it is unique and represents the authentic genius of its folk. This disavowed affinity is in fact what allows inter-fascist collaboration. And the phenomenon of inter-fascist collaboration is often more visible in an era of neo-fascism, but is older and more widespread than we think. The Condor Legion can stand for that. But this phenomenon can distract from the fact that various fascist movements across the world have their own autonomous existence, and in some cases, prior and separate worlds. So it did not take the Italians to give fascism its form, its name, and its content, and I'm sure some of the other papers will speak to this. Two further sets of distinctions are important. First, that of fascism in search of state power. At the stage of ideological proselytization and the building of a movement, and of fascism in possession of state power, at which point it is important not to confuse state capacity with fascism. The central examples of successful fascism were often those that had captured state power, the successful cousins, meaning that lesser movements that had not done so and had in some views therefore failed until they collaborated with the successful cousins during the Second World War, were taken less seriously in their own right. Now, we also need a final distinction, I think. Fascisms in their core period, which is still between the two world wars and up to the second and after, and just after, at which point their central tenets were in the process of being created and stabilised, and had not yet been widely discredited. And then fascisms after their core period, which is what makes them neo-fascisms. Now, here a peripheral example such as India is actually an interesting one because its fascism has never been discredited, not properly. The long road that other neo-fascisms had to follow before their older vocabulary had lost its previously discredited status and then could be used again did not have to be traversed, say, by an Indian fascism that had never lost legitimacy. In the aftermath of the Second World War, and as the Cold War showed itself to be of paramount importance, one could, of course, revive organizations that were seen, including by the new actors in the Cold War, as having been fascist, but, for instance, could be a counterweight to communism in their various countries, or could be reinvented as socialist movements if they were being supported by the Eastern Bloc. And so not only does the distinction between Europe and outside Europe tend to be less useful nowadays. But the connections between fascisms and neo-fascisms need to be placed under further scrutiny. And here, the use of vocabularies, of language, and of repertoire becomes important, not least because we do live in a world where we can no longer really, in many cases, distinguish at least the themes of the post-left from the themes of the neo-right. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hello, is this working now? Yeah, I'll take questions after I give my questions. Yeah. Okay. Thank you again for the wonderful journey. Ben, you said somewhere that at the organizational part of your speech that only other people can be fascist, but when, say, we started working with comparative fascism, we would see that the two main focal points of legitimate fascisms or non-peripheral fascisms or central fascism would not let other people be fascist. We are more fascist than others. Did you kill enough Jews? Things like that. So you said that, and how does the irony play out in the title? So this is the first question, or do you want me to ask the other?
No, just finish your questions. I'll answer them as a block.
And the second is, you talk at length about Indian fascism or the movement never been delegitimized, but there was a point in 1948 with the assassination of Gandhi that it had widespread delegitimization. I think it would be nice if you could say something about the re-legitimization of that, how it worked out. Yeah.
Perfect. No, I think that what's important when you say that other people have fascisms, we don't, it's basically based on the idea that there's a real fascism and a false fascism. And of course, you're perfectly right that the irony in the title is exactly that since we had it and we had it better, but we're over it now, then nobody else's can compare. The Jews question is very important. I don't think it's important that Jews in particular were the targets. You need a parallel target, which of course you can have anywhere else. You can have Armenians, you can have Muslims in India. You could always find your internal enemy that you had to purge. And that's more important than exactly what characteristics are given to it. And the quick second question you asked was?
The second question was about the fact that Indian fascism was delegitimized.
The Gandhi murder. Yeah. So the Gandhi murder is a very interesting moment because the person who kills Gandhi is told to resign his membership just before killing Gandhi. And the whole mechanism, including of former Gandhians, is geared to rescuing the RSS from this moment. So very soon after being banned, the organization declares it is no longer a political organization, it is a social help organization, it's a social service organization. And then within a couple of years, it is allowed to function again. So that delegitimization moment is a very small blip in the history of the larger movement.
You go first.
Okay. Can I have a microphone or no? You understand this. Okay. It's okay.
No, because we record, so it doesn't matter.
What's the record? Just give it to me.
We need the mic so that people are watching online.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Mario Kessler. I'm a historian, as many of you already know. And since we have here two very gifted colleagues from Calcutta, from India, please allow me to make a few remarks about a man who brings us to the core of your question, a man from Calcutta, which is Madhavendra Roy. We all are standing on the shoulders of giants. M.N. Roy was such a giant. After after the co-founder of the Communist Party of Mexico and of India, he left the Communist Party of Germany for an oppositional group, KP Opposition. He witnessed Hitler's rise in Germany, and he was among a circle of anti-Stalinist Marxist intellectuals and workers who published a series of articles which was called Fascist Rhetoric and Fascist Slogans. It was, you know it was in German in the journal Gegen den Strom, against the current, from the Communist Party opposition in 1931, and when you talked, I saw the striking similarities of what the comrades then discussed. The KPO was the first, even before Trotsky, it was the first organization which focused on a comparative theory of fascism, namely August Thalheimer. And Roy was one of the first who brought together the struggle against nationalism in the colonies, its trend to fascism, with the fights against European fascism. I stop here. I could say much more, but thank you very much for reminding me of this.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Shall I answer that, or shall we take a couple more?
I think we can
take a couple more,
and
yes.
then you generalize.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Can you get the mic to Louisa? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. Thinking of vocabulary and terminology, I was wondering, you see, in the Italian fascism, the vocabulary from futurism and Gabriele D'Annunzio, and generally from literary and artistic scenes, was very crucial. And actually, Mussolini did something to avoid confusing his own use of these terms with the use by the artists. I was wondering whether, is there anything similar in the Indian scene? Because no, well, it would be very interesting to try to look for it.
Can I comment? It depends on when we start looking at the Indian scene. If we look at the Indian scene around the 1860s, when the concepts are first coming in, then there are, as we know, we don't have a party yet, but the conceptual framework is struggling with these debates, the aesthetic, the political, and the movemental. And as we go into the struggle for independence, and we have divergence of nationalism proper and kind of fascism in India, then we see these debates collapsing because of the weight of the struggle of independence and its judicial and other aspects, the transfer of power. So we have a period of emptiness, and then when the parties, as Ben was saying, in search of power, when we have a framework that the parties are fighting the Indian National Congress and slowly trying to capture power. After the legitimacy they get back after being involved in murder of Gandhi, then these debates again come back. Slowly.
Very interesting. Is there anything written about this particular?
We are still struggling with the fact whether there is fascism in India. So, but recently a book called, I think, a book by Mirananda is out, and it is regarding Hindu nationalism and how it works with truth, post-truth, and things like that. She, I think, deals with some of these questions. Yeah.
I have the introduction of that book, but that's the only part that was sent to me, so I haven't read the rest of it yet. So let me answer Louisa first, and then Mario. The question of things that seem to be artistic exaggerations that then make their way into political movements, or artistic conceptualizations of an aestheticized politics, which then make themselves into politics. There isn't that much of a disavowal in many cases, and certainly in the material that I've seen on India, the disavowal part would actually defeat the exceptionalism argument that comes out with strands of post-colonial, now even more extremely decolonial movements, because the only criterion that seems to be relevant to such claims is that there's an element of authenticity in it, and we can debate what this authenticity is, whether this authenticity is a reinvented authenticity or not, or whether it is a modernist but drawing on authentic nativist intuitions and so on. I think the distinction has never been made because it is the obfuscation which makes it legitimate. If you start to separate what is an aesthetic category from what is meant to be a political category, then very often it defeats the purpose of legitimation that the link might have. Now you can see why in the phase of state power, you want to jettison forms of mysticism and obfuscation which brought you to power. It's a kind of conceptual night of the long knives, if you like, but it doesn't happen in India. Now, so obviously Mario's right. Have been reading M.N. Roy for a long time, and I could also go on, but I think the core of this is the debates about nationalism, which I think the communist left has always messed up. Yeah? The communist left has relied on Lenin's polemic against Rosa Luxemburg and has not taken Rosa Luxemburg seriously enough. That's the shorthand. But the actual argument is when M.N. Roy appears in 1920 at the Second Comintern Congress, and he says, let's stop romanticizing nationalism. And we must be able to distinguish between a progressive and a reactionary nationalism and not unequivocally support them all. Then he's making a point that is acknowledged and yet not acknowledged, because it goes in the minutes as a kind of amendment, becomes the Lenin-Roy thesis. It's actually weaker than Luxemburg's position, and it actually creates a situation which has consequences much further on in the Cold War, when basically everybody gets stuck in nationalism, and nationalism becomes a kind of substitute. And I could go on at great length about what it has done to the world, but that's basically the shorthand.
Okay, thank you, sir. Susan.
And then I think.
Okay.
Here. Thank you. And thank you, Ben, for a rich talk that could lead us in many directions, but I'm only going to take one, building a bit on Debajit's question. And I begin by raising a question that I really hope this conference will help me answer, because I don't find it clear. We know that fascism depends on having an enemy, I think usually an internal enemy, but as Ben rightly said, it certainly doesn't have to be Jews, it could be anybody, although there is a horrible instrumentalizing, self-interested tendency in the US, in Germany, in Israel to simply reduce fascism to anti-Semitism, and then to say, well, as long as we're not overtly anti-Semitic, we can't be fascists. But as I believe most people know here, but not everywhere, you know, the Nazis had two enemies, and they were equally crucial. But what I'm trying to figure out is that Jews are an ethnic enemy. Communists are a political enemy. And of course, they try to blur that distinction in ways that we all know. But I'm trying to figure out why, and this goes to Debajit's question, why India went through this post-war fascist period that it's still in, when it began as you know, the head of the non-aligned movement, as I've learned from your Nehru biography, you did not seem to begin with India. India did not seem to begin with the kind of anti-communism which created monsters out of communists, made it seem very obvious. So how, I know this is a big question, I'm sorry, and I've been building up to it, but why and how did India move from this non-aligned position where communists were not an obvious enemy to a point where I guess you didn't have a political enemy, but it became an ethnic enemy?
Shall I answer that, or should we take Amber's question?
Anybody else has a question?
Okay. So what I have, I think. So of course, one of the things that Hitler says in Mein Kampf, which for good reasons very few people read, is that a good politician merges the enemy into one, doesn't divert the anger of the masses into many directions. So it's very clear that this attempt to ethnicize the Bolshevik and to politicize the ethnic is going hand in hand. So this argument that you need such an enemy in India is always made by the right. Now we would talk about a right wing of Indian nationalism, but these aren't really nationalists even, because they're not particularly interested in all, let's put it differently, they're nationalists, but they're not anti-colonial nationalists. Their agenda is to create an ethno-state. And in this, obviously, those like who were writing circa 1938 suggesting that the Muslims would make a good analogous enemy to the German idea of the Jewish Bolshevik. They're also anti-communist, and very strongly so, which is one reason why they reappear in the 50s when the American assessment is, well, yeah, they're fascists, but they're not communists, so we can fund them. And that's a very important thing. Yeah.
So why were they anti-communist?
So they were anti-communist because, of course, no communist would ethnicize the political landscape. And I mean, the Communist Party is ridiculously optimistic about a non-ethnic political entity. When partition happens, the Communist Party decides that the same family will split, and parts of them will go to Pakistan and parts will stay in India, and they'll work together for the South Asian Revolution, which means that the family remains split today. So there are these kind of ridiculous questions. The question of non-alignment. Now, this is something that I did start to write about years ago, and I've become more and more convinced of this. So let's call it a Nehruvian tendency. And when I say Nehruvian, I don't mean connected to the person, but a tendency that has been given that name. It's a coalition. And it's a coalition that very strongly includes the Indian Communist Party. In some ways, Nehru is the last front organization. As a person. He's supported from outside by the communists. When his own government dismisses a state government which is communist, the Communist Party responds by saying it's not his fault, there are circumstances beyond his control that are acting on him. So why does that become ethnicized? Because this precise idea that the state must function outside of ethno-nationalist sectarian loyalties is something peculiar to a particular coalitional view of the nature of the state. And the tendency towards an ethno-state in India is very strongly the countervailing force. To some extent, according to Nehru's own account, it is a dominant force at independence. And he says, we can stop this by rigging the rules. A constitution exists to rig the rules against the sectarians. At least that would be my argument. And so in many ways, if you simply opt for a populist majoritarianism, the minority is defeated, lost, and oppressed. So you must rig the rules.
Amber.
Thank you. I'm going to bundle together two questions about language. One of them is mine, and one of them is from our Zoom audience. They're not the same question, but they might be related. It struck me, I think, unless I missed something, which I might have done, that amongst the fascist repertoire, you didn't mention the deranged way of getting on with concepts. There's this deranged sort of co-opting of language and deployment of concepts that we saw in the example that Susan gave, and at the same time, a kind of automatized deployment of this deranged sort of use of language that is used to really, well, it's used as a tool and has very curious and distorting effects on our ability to act. It reminded me, of course, of some things Hannah Arendt says about the way that moral language got co-opted and distorted. And that was one of the first sort of moves that needed to be made in order for the rest to be possible in the 1930s in Germany. And would you include that kind of co-opting and deranging of language, and then this widespread automatized use of the deranged meanings? Is that part of the fascist repertoire? So that's a question from me. Julia Schell asks the following. She prefaces it with two brief anecdotes from Brandenburg. The first, on the 30th September of this year, there was an AfD demonstration in Fürstenwalde, Brandenburg, where, in addition to German flags, the following slogan was held aloft: "Stop violence against indigenous people. Stop die Gewalt gegen Indigene." Second example. Shortly after the death of Charlie Kirk, the AfD Brandenburg submitted the following motion to the state parliament: "Preventing anti-fascist terrorism, our universities must not be safe havens for left-wing extremists." It included the sentence, "Addressing the conservative influencer Kirk as a fascist undoubtedly proves the anti-fascist intent to murder." The question is, why is the political right able to occupy terms like this while the left wing has estranged its followership with that for years? Follow-up to that, what are the tactics to respond? Explain the terms, fight for them, reclaim them, or seek a new language?
So, to the first part of that question, which is yours, Amber, yes, there is a lot of stretching of existing concepts into kind of bizarre language, and I guess Julia's examples would be some examples of that stretching. But what's interesting to me is how the reclaiming doesn't happen. I mean, I certainly think that I won't call them the left anymore. Let's call them a post-left as shorthand. There is no left. There is a post-left that has a very different conceptual framework that operates according to the same kind of lumping and generalizations that you see on the right. So if an AfD demonstration makes a point that we should all be making, then the AfD has seized upon an orphaned issue. And I don't think that's something that is so amazing. On the question of Charlie Kirk in particular, I think he has, a great many people outside of the United States had never heard of him until until he was murdered. But what has happened really is that it has become the focal point for the idea that I would call them the post-left, but for the polemics of the right, they are still the left. According to this polemic, the left no longer debates, they'd rather shoot you. Right? Now this is a triumph. It's a magnificent triumph for the right. And when somebody says that these lunatics are taking over the universities, are they entirely wrong? Because I don't see the kind of debate that we used to have where you could actually confront right and left in a conversation and an argument, where you knew that there was something to be gained by this confrontation. We now have our own hermetically sealed worlds in which we do not know, As symptomatic of that is, in universes where we can only listen to people we only agree with, we don't even begin to know how a right wing thinks. So in that situation, how do you avoid such a thing? Are you saying that we must, because we've heard this, the only good fascist is a dead fascist, it follows that once you've declared somebody a fascist, there's no longer a need to debate. Now this may be something which is correct at a certain stage, but a priori, as I think I said in the beginning, the overuse of the term fascism simply serves to legitimate rather than delegitimate. And I think this is a very provisional answer, but I really think that the question of Kirk does raise this answer. This is somebody whose performative acts were all let's talk. Whether this is a true or a false act is irrelevant. Politics is largely performative. When the left performs by saying we don't want to talk to him, and when an incredible amount of people who should have known better and who'd never heard of him before he got shot said he's a right-winger, it's okay, then the debate is lost. This is not a debate. So if the IFT wants to pick up an orphaned issue and say, now we can run with this, we've been given this issue on a plate, what would you do if you were a right-wing party? Would you say, oh, we don't want it, that's a left-wing issue? It's not.
I would have to ask for any more questions because we are very short on time. Any more? No. Thank you, Ben. Thanks so much.